The only way to get rid of misconceptions about contemplation is to experience it. One who does not actually know in their own life the nature of this breakthrough and this awakening to a new level of reality cannot help being misled by most of the things that are said about it. For contemplation cannot be taught. It cannot even be clearly explained. It can only be hinted at, suggested, pointed to, symbolized. The more objectively and scientifically one tries to analyze it, the more they empty it of its real content. For this experience is beyond the reach of verbalization and of rationalization. Nothing is more repellent than a pseudo-scientific definition of the contemplative experience. One reason for this is that one who attempts such a definition is tempted to proceed psychologically, and there is really no adequate psychology of contemplation. To describe reactions and feelings is to situate contemplation where it is not to be found, in the superficial consciousness where it can be observed by reflection. But this reflection and this consciousness are precisely part of that external self which dies and is cast aside like a soiled garment in the genuine awakening of the contemplative. Contemplation is not and cannot be a function of this external self. There is an irreducible opposition between the deep transcendent self that awakens only in contemplation and the superficial external self, which we commonly identify with the first person singular. We must remember that this superficial I is not our real self. It is our individuality and our empirical self, but it is not truly the hidden and mysterious person in whom we subsist before the eyes of God. The I that works in the world thinks about itself, observes its own reactions, and talks about itself, is not the true I that has been united to God in Christ. It is at best the vesture, the mask, the disguise of that mysterious and unknown self, whom most of us never discover until we are dead. Our external, superficial self is not eternal, not spiritual, far from it. This self is doomed to disappear as completely as smoke from a chimney. It is utterly frail and evanescent. Contemplation is precisely the awareness that this I is really not I, and is the awakening of the unknown I that is beyond observation and reflection, and is incapable of commenting upon itself. It cannot even say I with the assurance and the impertinence of the other one, for its very nature is to be hidden, unnamed, unidentified in the society where people talk about themselves and about one another. In such a world, the true I remains both inarticulate and invisible, because it has altogether too much to say, not one word of which is about itself. Nothing could be more alien to contemplation than the cogito ergo sum of Descartes. I think, therefore I am. This is the declaration of an alienated being, in exile from his own spiritual depths, compelled to seek some comfort in a proof for his own existence, based on the observation that he thinks. If his thought is necessary as a medium through which he arrives at the concept of his existence, then he is in fact only moving further away from his true being. He is reducing himself to a concept. he is making it impossible for himself to experience directly and immediately the mystery of his own being. At the same time, by also reducing God to a concept, he makes it impossible for himself to have any intuition of the divine reality, which is inexpressible. He arrives at his own being as if it were an objective reality. That is to say, he strives to become aware of himself as he would of something alien to himself. And he proves that the thing exists. He convinces himself, I am therefore something. And then he goes on to convince himself that God, the infinite, the transcendent, is also a thing, an object, like other finite and limited objects of our thought. Contemplation, on the contrary, is the experiential grasp of reality as subjective, not so much mine, which would signify belonging to the external self, but myself in existential mystery. Contemplation does not arrive at reality after a process of deduction, but by an intuitive awakening in which our free and personal reality becomes fully alive to its own existential depths, which open out into the mystery of God. For the contemplative, there is no cogito, I think, and no ergo, therefore, but only sum, I am. Not in the sense of a futile assertion of our individuality as ultimately real, but in the humble realization of our mysterious being as persons in whom God dwells, with infinite sweetness and inalienable power. Obviously, contemplation is not just the affair of a passive and quiet temperament. It is not mere inertia, a tendency to inactivity, to psychic peace. The contemplative is not merely a person who likes to sit and think, still less one who sits around with a vacant stare. Contemplation is much more than thoughtfulness or a taste for reflection. Certainly, a thoughtful and reflective disposition is nothing to be despised in our world of inanity and automatism, and it can very well dispose a person for contemplation. Contemplation is not prayerfulness or a tendency to find peace and satisfaction in liturgical rites. These too are a great good, and they are almost necessary preparations for contemplative experience. They can never of themselves constitute that experience. Contemplative intuition has nothing to do with temperament. Though it sometimes happens that a person of quiet temperament becomes a contemplative, it may also happen that the very passivity of their character keeps them from suffering the inner struggle and the crisis through which one generally comes to a deeper spiritual awakening. On the other hand, it can happen that an active and passionate person awakens to contemplation, and perhaps suddenly, without too much struggle. But it must be said as a rule that certain active types are not disposed to contemplation and never come to it except with great difficulty. Indeed, they ought perhaps not even to think about it or seek it, because in doing so, they will tend to strain themselves and injure themselves by absurd efforts that cannot possibly make any sense or have any useful purpose. Such people, being given to imagination, passion, and active conquest, exhaust themselves in trying to attain contemplation as if it were some kind of object, like a material fortune or a political office or a professorship. But contemplation can never be the object of calculated ambition. It is not something we plan to obtain with our practical reason, but the living water of the Spirit that we thirst for, like a hunted deer thirsting after a river in the wilderness. It is not we who choose to awaken ourselves, but God who chooses to awaken us. Contemplation is not trance or ecstasy, nor the hearing of sudden unutterable words, nor the imagination of lights. It is not the emotional fire and sweetness that come with religious exaltation. It is not enthusiasm, the sense of being seized by an elemental force and swept into liberation by mystical frenzy. These things may seem to be in some way like a contemplative awakening, insofar as they suspend the ordinary awareness and control exercised by our empirical self. But they are not the work of the deep self, only of the emotions, of the somatic unconscious. They are a flooding up of the Dionysian forces of the id. Such manifestations can of course accompany a deep and genuine religious experience, but they are not what I am talking about here as contemplation. Nor is contemplation the gift of prophecy, nor does it imply the ability to read the secrets of a person's heart. These things can sometimes go along with contemplation, but they are not essential to it, and it would be erroneous to confuse them with it. Let no one hope to find in contemplation an escape from conflict, from anguish, or from doubt. On the contrary, the deep, inexpressible certitude of the contemplative experience awakens a tragic anguish and opens many questions in the depths of the heart, like wounds that cannot stop bleeding. For every gain in deep certitude, there is a corresponding growth of superficial doubt. This doubt is by no means opposed to genuine faith, but it mercilessly examines and questions the spurious faith of everyday life. The human faith, which is nothing but the passive acceptance of conventional opinion. This false faith, which is what we often live by, and which we even come to confuse with our religion, is subjected to inexorable questioning. This torment is a kind of trial by fire in which we are compelled by the very light of invisible truth which has reached us in the dark ray of contemplation to examine, to doubt, and finally to reject all the prejudices and conventions that we have hitherto accepted as if they were dogmas. Hence is it clear that genuine contemplation is incompatible with complacency and with smug acceptance of prejudiced opinions. It is not mere passive acquiescence in the status quo, as some would like to believe, for this would reduce it to the level of spiritual anesthesia. Contemplation is no painkiller. What a holocaust takes place in this steady burning to ashes of old, worn-out words, clichés, slogans, rationalizations. The worst of it is that even apparently holy conceptions are consumed along with all the rest. It is a terrible breaking and burning of idols, a purification of the sanctuary, so that no graven thing may occupy the place that God has commanded to be left empty. The center, the existential altar, which simply is. In the end, the contemplative suffers the anguish of realizing that they no longer know what God is. They may or may not mercifully realize that, after all, this is a great gain, because God is not a what, not a thing. That is precisely one of the essential characteristics of contemplative experience. It sees that there is no what that can be called God. There is no such thing as God, because God is neither a what nor a thing, but a pure who. God is the Thou, before whom our inmost I springs into awareness. God is the I Am, before whom, with our own most personal and inalienable voice, we echo, I am.